Je me présente, je suis Raphaël Gani, professeur adjoint à la Faculté des sciences de l'éducation depuis maintenant 1 an et demi, spécialiste en didactique de l'histoire. Donc, il y a un lien avec ce que je vais vous présenter aujourd'hui en termes de continuité avec un symposium qu'on a fait avec les collègues du CRIFPE-Laval qui s'intitulait « Récits et pédagogie » en mai dernier au colloque du CRIFPE national. Donc, on se rappellera, plusieurs de nos collègues, dont je vois ici Denis Jeffrey, qui avait organisé ce symposium-là qui durait une journée où on parlait des liens entre récits et différents types d'enseignement. Donc, j'ai pensé pour continuer la discussion sur cette thématique-là qui est centrale, qui occupe pour plusieurs de nous une place importante dans nos travaux, j'ai pensé inviter un collègue, Arthur Chapman, qui est maintenant full professor à la University of College London. C'est aussi le directeur du département du curriculum, de la pédagogie et de l'assessment. Donc, il vient ici nous parler d'une recherche qu'il a menée auprès d'élèves sur leur capacité narrative. Puis enfin, je voulais souligner qu'Arthur, pour ceux que ça intéresse, a un livre qui est en accès libre. Donc, vous pouvez le googler. Ça s'appelle « Knowing History in School, Powerful Knowledge and the Powers of Knowledge » à UCL Press. Donc, c'est un livre en libre accès. Donc, libre à vous de le consulter. La présentation devrait durer une trentaine de minutes. On prendra les questions après. Je pense qu'Arthur nous présente un travail exploratoire. Il va être vraiment intéressé d'avoir vos commentaires là-dessus. Et puis, le tout va se dérouler en anglais, mais sachez que je pourrai agir là, à titre de traducteur dans la période de questions, le cas échéant. Donc, je laisse le micro à Arthur.
So, thank you, Raphael. Thank you to the university for inviting me. And thank you to everybody for allowing me to present to you in English in Quebec. It's an honor. I would try and present in French, but my French is very poor, so I apologize. Okay, so my topic, as Raphael said, is narrative agency. And this is an idea that I'm interested in exploring in history education. It's not something we talk about very much in England. It's new territory for me. And so the presentation I'm going to give is quite exploratory, as Raphael said. I'm hoping we can interact as well. So there may be times when I have questions for you, and I hope somebody will answer. But also as well, if you want to ask me questions and interrupt, that's absolutely fine. I'm not going to present in a very formal way. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is, why should we care about developing children's narrative agency? I'll try and explain what I mean by narrative agency as we go along. But the reasons we should care are many, and they relate to the presence of narrative in our world. As many people have argued, narrative is fundamental to being human, but we live in a world that's shot through and structured by narratives. And some of these narratives are quite dangerous. All of them are important. And I think it's very important, and here I'm getting towards what I mean by narrative agency, that children and young people and citizens understand narratives so they can think critically about them and have power over the narratives rather than allow the narratives to overpower them. That's the kind of thing I've got in mind. What I mean, a narrative that's had a lot of impact in my country, almost invariably for the worse, in my opinion, is the political narrative project of Brexit, which you see represented here by Boris Johnson, thankfully no longer the Prime Minister of my country. And you can see on this bus that he's standing in front of, in fact, it's a lorry, take back control, let's take back control, which is a genius political slogan that carries within it an entire narrative between us versus them in this case being the European Union. And there's a whole sort of paradigm story we could explore there. This is one example of what I mean by narrative in the present. This is quite interesting. I don't know if colleagues have come across this. This is a monument that was put up overnight by the Hungarian government in 2014. They did it overnight under cover of darkness to avoid protest and counter monuments. But the monument tells a very simplistic story about Hungary in the 20th century. You can see the angel Gabriel holding an orb. The orb symbolizes Hungary. Down onto this orb is swooping a black eagle representing Germany. And this is telling a particular story about Hungary under German occupation, Hungary in the Second World War. We need a story to account for what happened because many appalling tragedies took place in Hungary at that time. For example, in 1944, the murder of almost all of the Jews of Hungary in Auschwitz. But this monument tries to deliver a narrative of a very simplistic kind. And this is what you would call Holocaust distortion, because it puts all the bad outside Hungary, it others the problem. And a lot of our narratives actually work by doing that, by setting up us and them, polarities, and by othering bad things. As many of you will know, the Holocaust in Hungary was in large part German, but also, of course, Hungarian. I was in Budapest in 2018 talking to a Holocaust survivor. He said to me, I was in 3 detention camps. I never once met a German, okay? All of the people detaining him were Hungarian. So this is an example of another kind of toxic, simplifying narrative with dangerous consequences, and also a self-deceptive narrative as well. What this does is it allows people in Hungary to avoid confronting the Holocaust and their role in it. What's interesting, though, is that people of Hungary do not buy this narrative. The picture on the right-hand side of the slide here is what happened almost immediately afterwards. The government put up this monument telling a simplistic narrative. The people of Budapest began to put chairs in front of it and hang pictures on those chairs of victims of the Hungarian state as a kind of counter-narrative challenging this memory culture that was a culture of distortion. Another example, of course, is the kinds of narrative, kinds of conspiracy theory that are very familiar to us as educators, I'm sure, and surround us in the world. I've got an image here of the so-called QAnon shaman. The QAnon narrative interests me greatly because one of my areas of research is anti-Semitism, and the QAnon narrative is just a refunctioned version of classic anti-Semitic tropes about conspiracy theories, elites, attacking children, and so on. But this is an example of a narrative that's common in our present and has very damaging effects in the real world. So, narrative is important. It's important that children can consume it critically and young people have the tools to do that. We can see that narrative being abused and used in all sorts of things. For example, in the war in Ukraine, of course, as people know, I assume it's been in the newspapers a lot, the Russian state are rewriting the history textbook narratives to obliterate the existence of Ukraine through a kind of cultural denial of its very existence, creating a victim narrative around the Russian state. But also as well, Western journalists, for example, this piece here with the subtitle Vlad the Mad contain deeply troubling, I think, very simplistic narratives that reduce the world and its complexity to simple binaries, mad versus sane, Vlad versus the rest of us. Okay, so that first part of my presentation is just making the point that narrative matters, and it matters that we educate children to be critical consumers of narrative. I'm going to be optimistic about historians. Whenever I present this slide, and I've used it once already in a presentation in Murcia in Spain back in May, people say that historians are part of the problem, and I'm idealizing them. So I'll admit maybe that this is a slightly idealized version of historians, but it seems to me that whatever historians are, they should be expert in narrative complexity. And therefore, history education ought to be quite a good antidote to narrative oversimplification. I'm going to use one of my favorite historians, the very late now Raphael Samuel, who died in 1996. And he said in a book of his I was recently rereading, a historian is naturally resistant to conspiracy theory. Now, I appreciate this is an idealization. Colleagues have said to me that there are good examples of historians in Poland, for example, contributing to national distortion. But anyway, what does Samuel mean? I think there's something in it, even if not all historians live up to this model. The quotation comes from a book of his on the miners' strike. And the miners' strike is something that meant a lot to people of my generation. I lived through it as a teenager. It was a very polarized moment in many ways, like so many of the moments we experience now. And the government of Margaret Thatcher deployed this narrative, which is summed up in the title of this book. They described the miners as, quote, the enemy within. So there was a kind of fifth column attacking the nation. We all needed to rally round and defeat these people who weren't really part of our people, but were within us. Raphael Samuel, the historian, finds this really troubling. And here are some of the reasons why. First of all, he says, what we have here is melodrama, a type of narrative genre in which the world is reduced to archetypes, simple archetypes of the good versus the evil. We have personalization, complex social change, complex economic issues become reduced to the intentions of key actors who are either good or bad in this melodramatic way. Everything is explained in terms of intention. Now, personally, I feel, and I know a lot of other people in social science feel, that one of the key concepts that we learn as social scientists or historians is the idea of unintended consequences. If you're going to try and explain why things happen in the world, simplistic, if you like, folk narrative about the world wants to explain everything in terms of the actions and aims of individuals who can be characterized as straightforwardly good or bad and allow you to get a melodramatic narrative going. One of the key insights of social science is that many of the things that happen in the world happen despite the fact that nobody wanted them. Many of the things that we experience in life in social complex organizations are the outcome of the interaction of many different intentions and the result of no one intention in particular. So Samuel says this narrative the government were using to try and stigmatize, other and attack elements of our working class is also based on simplistic folk psychology. And then there's the narrative framingly detected in this. The enemy, there is an enemy, we must fight them. What we have here is the deployment of a kind of heuristical structure. And then, as I said already, othering. So this is what I mean by saying I think historians are quite good at complexity and narrative. Raphael Samuel, living through this conflict about politics and economics, decides to analyze it using the tools of historical thinking. And what he says about it, he generalizes from it. And I want to hold on to this, even though I realize it's an idealization. So, to quote, historians will know that leaders are not so much causes as effects. They will know that decision-making is not an event, but a process in which 1,000 different circumstances conspire. And they may remember, if they're readers of Tolstoy or students of the First World War, that in a battle, nobody is less in command than the generals. A strike is not a controllable process, but a huge wave of happenings. Even when a strike appears to be directed from above, its energies come from below. I'm not sure that we'll agree with all of that. We might want to contest some of it. But what it shows, I think, is an appreciation of the complexity of narrative, the kind of appreciation that comes from being expert in modeling, studying, trying to explain real-world phenomena in the way that people like historians do. So what I'm trying to say then, to sum up the first two moves in my presentation, is number one, we live in a world, our children live in a world, students and citizens in our society live in a world structured by narratives, many of which operate in quite toxic structural ways. Melodramatic narratives, simplistic narratives, othering narratives. And the second thing I want to say is that I think historians have perceptions and ways of thinking that can help to challenge that. So my next move comes to history education and tries to ask, what might we do? How might we bring the insights that historians can generate and that history as a discipline can help to contribute to the education of our young people? I want to talk about narrative competence, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. You know, many people, for example, in Quebec, in Canada, Stéphane Lévesque. There are many others, of course. In Germany, Jorn Rüsen have talked about narrative competence as a key idea. And I want to say that we've neglected this in history education, and we need to start to work on it. I am trying to do that myself. I'm sure many others are doing a better job. So we can think about history then as being polarized, or at least history as it appears in schools, between two things. On the one hand, the sources. We're very used to teaching lessons using sources as history teachers. But on the other hand, there are the narratives, and the narratives are often what we tell in our classes. We might help the children build the narratives by working with sources and giving them questions, inquiries to engage in. Borrowing now from German history didactics, we would call this construction, or the Germans would anyway. What you do is you answer questions about the past using sources, and as a result, you make narratives. This is extremely important. It's not my focus. I know I'll leave that to other people. My research, going back now for really since the late 90s, has been focused on what I'm learning to call deconstruction. This is not Derrida, it's inspired by the Germans. The idea that we start with the narratives in history education, because actually, how does history appear in the world our children live in? It doesn't appear that often as sources. It appears as ready-made narratives about the past. And my claim is that history education should pay as much attention to the arrow coming from the narratives, a deconstructive arrow that asks us to think about how those narratives are made. We should pay as much attention to that as to the constructive arrow that goes from the sources to the narratives, which is what most people in history education have actually focused on, certainly in the last 50 years, working with sources to make stories. I'm saying we need to focus as much with our kids on taking narratives apart to build their narrative competence. Stéphane and Jean-Philippe Courteau have written this very good book, which I'm sure you know. The French version, no doubt, it came out first, actually. And the kind of thing we're talking about here is developing the understanding of how credible stories are made. How do you make a credible story about the past? That would be something we would try and develop through teaching deconstruction of narratives. What do credible stories look like? How can we check stories in terms of their credibility? These are some of the questions that I've got in mind. Okay, so I'm now going to try and outline what I think we might do in order to build this kind of narrative competence. And I think this is of interest beyond history, because history is only one of the disciplines that deals with stories. And I've learned as much as a history educator from literary theory or from anthropology as I have from historians. And in fact, there's always an interaction between these. So I think what I'm talking about is of interest way beyond the history itself. Okay, so what do we need to develop in our young people? I think awareness of narrative patterns. Stories have shapes. Knowing that stories have shapes helps you recognize the shape of the story that you're told. If you recognize the shape of the story, if you're used to thinking about the shape stories have, you can ask critical questions about the stories people present you with. I'll elaborate that further in a minute. What are plausible representations and what are implausible representations? What tools do we need to have to explore that issue? I think the discipline of narratology has a lot to teach us about that. And I'm going to say a bit about that. The question of narrative patterns and emplotment is also a narratological question. And I think history education would be much enhanced if only we listened a bit more to the narrative theorists as well as to the epistemologists. It's not just about knowledge, it's about stories and how they're made and what makes a credible, well-structured story. Not only that, I think, and this is the thing I'm going to focus on in most of what I say today, point 3, because I've done a bit of work on that. It's preliminary work, I need to do more, but at least I've started. And my contention is we need to have all of these 3 things explored more in history education if we're going to develop a narrative agency in our students. So to do this, to talk about narrative patterns, I'm going to talk about James Virch, a narrative theorist and student of Vygotsky, who's had a lot of important influence in history education. But I'm also going to talk about the novelist Kurt Vonnegut. When it comes to thinking about representation in critical ways, I'm going to go to Stefan Todorov, who did his research and did his teaching in France, but as a Bulgarian in origin, and had experience of totalitarian regimes, which gave him a certain awareness of the importance of a normative framework when thinking about stories. And then I'm going to present some work I've done recently with a teacher. Okay, so starting then with emplotment. We should be thinking about what kinds of patterns stories can have, and what a plausible, realistic pattern is. There are some kinds of stories, melodrama, which have power in the world, but do not actually accurately represent how the world works. James Virch, in a number of books, as I said, many of them beginning with Vygotsky, but going further in the most recent one, here, How Nations Remember. He's been talking a lot about a lot of other people as well, apart from Vygotsky. But he's developed quite high-level work on narrative templates. His proposition is that actually you can differentiate nations in the world by the shape of the story they most frequently tell themselves. So, for example, in the case of Russia, which is discussed a lot, or rather the USSR actually, in the central book here and also in the book on the left, he talks a lot about the triumph over alien forces narrative. And actually, you think about Putin and think about the narratives Putin is using in Russian textbooks, you can see the triumph over alien forces narrative template being used there. So Jim Virch then does work on story structure and does research which suggests that different story structures have a power in different contexts, but it's all quite high level. What I want to argue for is taking that insight and developing it more. What kind of schemas, as the psychologist might put it, are involved in storytelling at a granular level, not just at the large scale level of the big national myths, but even at a small scale level when you comprehend or tell a story. And I said I'd talk about Kurt Vonnegut. I don't know if people know, he failed his MA, I think in anthropology, I think in Chicago, but subsequently talked a lot about the things he did. Of course, he's also a novelist. Vonnegut talked about the shapes of stories using graphs to model decline and upward and downward movement in fortune. And this was apparently the focus of his MA, which was not well received, but that puts him in good company. Walter Benjamin was not well received by his professors. Vonnegut talks about lots of different patterns. And you can see the first three I've got on the slide, now from where I am to the right-hand side of the room. The first three have a very clear shape. They're either, they start well, they get the fortune declines, and then you move up again. That's one narrative pattern. There are various different ones. What Vonnegut is trying to say is that actually only some of these are plausible representations of reality. And of these, I think the last one, the which way is up, is the kind of pattern that he's advocating. So reality doesn't have one obvious narrative thread. Reality is interwoven from many different intentions, many different people positing different narrative threads. It's never really clear until we're dead what's happening to us. What is the arc of our story? We don't necessarily know until we know the end of it. And which way is up, rather than now things have got better, it is the kind of insight that he's pointing to. So I think what I'm trying to say is it would be good in education if we started to get kids to think about the kinds of stories people use when they structure narratives. What kind of political narratives are used in our country? What shape do they have? And of course, to have a shape, to have a discernible line of improvement and so on, you have to say there's one central person about who the narrative is. In reality, is that true? A lot of national stories are about a we. Are we a we in any straightforward, simple sense? Or do we, if I can quote the Bible, contain multitudes? If we is actually a collective of lots of different people with different narrative paradigms organizing their lives, then there cannot be a single narrative arc. And if someone's trying to tell you there is, what they're trying to do is prioritize one understanding. Okay, so by talking about narrative patterns, that's what I mean. The next thing I want to talk about is a plausible representation of actors. So narrative is not just a pattern of plot an implotment. It's a scenario with agents in it. How can we decide whether agents are represented in incredible ways? I think we can go to film theory. So I don't know if people know David Bordwell, an American film studies scholar. He's written many books. I'm currently working my way through all of them. They're superb in my opinion. And he brings the tools of cognitive science to the question of how watchers of films construct stories. And he wants to talk about learned patterns. So different audiences with different cultures will have different ideas about narrative patterning, different schemata that they use to interpret film data when they're watching a film as a story. And Bordwell starts to break this down. He does actually many interesting things with it in later books, but in this, his first major book on this, he talks about two kinds of things. Template schemata, which as soon as I read that, it took me straight to Verge. Verge talks about templates. But as I've been trying to argue by talking about Vonnegut, Verge's templates are really, really large scale. We need differentiated ones. We need them at a granular level as well as at a big level. So I think there's a lot to be said for exploring the kinds of templates that people use to construct stories. It could be a template for patterns over time. That's what Vonnegut does. But there are also templates for situations. Now, what kind of situation is this? There's going to be a schema for that as well. And if we're going to try and get children to think about stories, we need to develop their repertoire of interpretive schema that they can use to construct narratives. We want them to think about how they're understanding a story and the other ways in which it might be understood. So from Bordwell, we get the idea of templates for situations, for actions, for events over time. But not only that, he talks about prototypes as well. Actors, who are the actors? What are the ways in which we can schematize what individuals might be? In that Mindless Strike book I was talking about, we have the enemy within. We have the melodrama as a way of framing how we think about actors. If you think about classic sort of genres like the English country house murder, Agatha Christie and so on, which gets into the game Cluedo, with all these stereotypes like Colonel Mustard, the ex-military person who's involved in the murder, or Miss Scarlet, the femme fatale, or Professor Plum, the academic. But this is what Bordwell means by prototypes. What kind of prototypes are operational in the stories we're telling and listening to? Some of those prototypes will be highly schematic, highly stereotyped, and we would want children to question them and deconstruct them. But what I'm saying then is, as well as thinking about narrative shapes and patterns, we need to elaborate that further, templates for situations, templates for action sequences. Not only that, we need to develop prototypes for people, and also not simply to develop these things, but to get kids asking questions about them when they watch stories. And asking these kinds of questions allows you to talk about narrative realism and plausibility. Let's go to Todorov. As I said, Todorov is not just a narrative theorist, and he does that brilliantly, as I'm sure people will know. He writes very well, for example, about the fantastic as a genre. He also writes really well about Columbus and the conquistadores and the kind of narratives that they had when they did what they did. But he also writes about the 20th century and totalitarianism. And what Todorov wants you to do and wants us to try and encourage among ourselves and other people is a self-critical awareness of the kinds of stories we're telling ourselves. It's very possible to tell oneself comforting stories. In fact, this is the human default. We all want to boost our egos, satisfy ourselves that we are good, and Todorov provides tools for questioning that. So here's one, for example. In this book, Hope and Memory, which, like all of his work, was first of all published in French, he talks about different narrative positions we can adopt. You can think of yourself or your community as a benefactor, as somebody who has done good in the world to other people. In England, we like to do that a lot. We talk about the British Empire, believe it or not, as if it was an agent that did nothing but good in the world. The opposite of a benefactor is you might construct your nation or your identity or your group identity in a negative way as a malefactor, as someone who does bad in the world. But you don't find that very much. And Todorov says, next time you're talking about yourself, consider how you're mapping your self-identity onto this model. As well as a benefactor and a malefactor, the benefactor being a high status thing to have, we also have other possibilities. If you are, your nation, your group, your identity, constructed as a beneficiary, what you're saying is someone else did good to you in the past. Todorov says no one really wants to be a beneficiary. It's a position of relative weakness. It makes you dependent upon other people. This is not an attractive narrative self-positioning. And hopefully we can see how this might help us think. To be critical of the stories you tell yourself is to ask, am I telling stories? Are we telling stories in which we privilege ourselves in a positive role? Or do we allow ourselves to consider points at which the identities we subscribe to may have been maleficent rather than beneficent, may have been beneficiaries rather than benefactors? Finally, the victim. A victim, Todorov says, and this is an interesting point, a victim, he says, is actually quite a powerful thing to position yourself as narratively because it gives you a claim. You can say, bad things have happened. They need to be put right. So for Todorov, position 1 and position 4 are self-affirming positions to take. Position 3 and position 2 are not. And he says, when you're thinking about stories, think about this, think critically about this, and think about where you're being self-positioned. How about we try that with kids? To me, this just has the resonance with Piaget and notions like egotism. What kind of story do we tell ourselves? Who are we, of course, going back to the idea that simple identities should be problematized. Maybe that's a useful tool. All right, so far I've just been speculating, using things that I've come across that I know other people use and that might be interesting. Now let's talk about something practical that I've actually done. I'm just going to check on time. How am I doing for time, Raphael?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, I'll move quickly then. So, and I'll skip what I've got here. So I've been recently with a school teacher in Manchester. I've been working on some lessons about an event in British history from 1819 called the Peterloo Massacre. And we designed a series of lessons drawing upon narratology, or basically media studies, ideas from film theory. And the idea was that if we do this, maybe the children will get a better sense of what's involved in making history. And we took a very simple metaphor. In a way, it's problematic because you can't film the past. But we decided the risks were worth it because of the way it would allow us to make the concrete, the abstract concrete. So we took this idea of perspective, modeled on the idea of a camera. Where is it pointing? Where is it positioned? Focus, what you focus the camera on and how closely or how zoomed out or zoomed in you are as a narrator. And then finally, scene and summary. When I'm telling a story, I can tell something blow by blow. It all began at 5 o'clock in the morning. I got up, I made my coffee, the cat stood on my foot. This is quite, minute by minute narrative. Or I can say many years later, as he faced the firing squad, which is how Gabriel García Márquez begins his book, Cientos Años de Soledad. So, scene and summary. What do I narrate in detail and what do I skip over? Okay, let's just talk about what we actually did in practice. So, we used 2 graphic novels to explore this with children. And we worked with historians and graphic artists who made these novels to develop the materials. All the materials are available to use and might be inspirational for other people who want to try the same approach. And this PowerPoint, Raphael has a copy, I'm sure it can be distributed. Okay, what did we do then? We took, as I said, these 3 ideas of perspective, focus, scene and summary, and we asked the children to think about decisions. So as a narrator, I've got to make a decision about perspective. Right? If I'm drawing a graphic novel, where is the eye whose vision I'm presenting positioned? Rather like where we would position a camera if that's what we were doing. So just to give you an example, this is the image of the event that took place at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester in August 1819. And here you can see a God's eye perspective on the crowd beginning to assemble on this field. We asked the kids, when in the graphic novel is a zoomed out, God's eye, third person or not involved in the actual narrative, when is that kind of perspective used? And why is that used? What would happen if you took a different perspective? So we flick between things like that, which is the God's eye perspective, and this image. And if we had more time, I'd slowly deconstruct it with you and ask, where are we? Where is the camera, as it were, in this picture? And actually, it's a picture positioned from within the crowd, looking at the army in this event. And actually, where you position the camera, as it were, where you choose to depict events from, is going to have a really big impact on how those events are perceived and understood. So here you can see a crowd position, rather than, if you like, a neutral position, not involved in the actual events. And we got the children thinking about that. Also, what does the narrator choose to focus on? What do they choose to narrate in detail, and what do they choose to narrate in brevity as well? This is a really interesting picture that the graphic novel of the Peterloo Massacre contains. They don't show gore. They don't show cut open chests. They don't show people's heads bleeding profusely. What they do is they show grass with blood on it. And we asked the kids to think about that. That's an interesting choice. Why not show the violence directly? What is being done through this kind of more figurative way of representing things? What difference would it make to the narrative if there was much more, split open heads, rather than this slightly discreet way of showing the blood? This is really, really focused in. It's showing you blades of grass. That's an interesting decision. Why did they do that? What would happen if you zoomed out further? And here is an alternative picture from the book as well, which is slightly more zoomed out. In fact, they're two that are related. You can see the grass, but you also see more of the field if you zoom out. So all the time in these lessons, we're exploring these concepts, focus, perspective, and asking the kids the question, what decisions have they made about focus, the designers of this book? What decisions have they made about perspective? We played little clips of the historians and the graphic artists talking about why they made those decisions. And then here's the crucial thing. You ask the kids, okay, let's think about making different decisions. What if they'd done something different? How would that affect the message, the representation? Finally, scene and summary. So here you can see 4 frames. It takes up 1 page of the graphic novel. And these 4 frames cover only a couple of really short minutes. There's a mother talking to her son. The son's grasping a toy, a transitional object. He's nervous in this big crowd. The mother and son are talking to each other for the first 2 frames. So you're quite invested in this relationship. And then kaboom, the mother is knocked over by a cavalryman. The toy falls to the ground. And actually, in some of the later images, you can see the trampled toy. And then somebody, a member of the crowd, intervenes to help the child and look after the mother. But my point is, though, that this is blow by blow, second by second, on the actual field. And on the next page, we have what happens to that child when he grows up. And his entire life is narrated in 1 paragraph with 1 image. So, why do that? Why focus on the child and the mother being knocked over, the toy being knocked out of his hand? Why briefly cover this bit? What happens if that was different? Let's think about alternative narrations, we asked the kids. And I should say that the final task in this sequence of lessons was for them to propose their own graphic novel, making decisions about all of these things, what you focus on, what perspective you take, and so on. And just to illustrate that, and to dramatize something I haven't stressed enough, which is the notion of decision, right? This whole scheme of work is asking children to think about decisions that narrators take. Something which is brilliant and really helped us is the fact they couldn't decide at first on what front cover to have for one of the graphic novels. There's a graphic novel for children, there's a graphic novel for adults. In the adult one, they couldn't decide on the front cover at first. And we got the kids to think about these 2 front covers, and if I had more time, I'd deconstruct them with you now. But what perspective is taken here on the left as opposed to on the right? And it's interesting to think about that. On the left, actually, just to give you the answer, because we haven't got time to discuss it, we are in the crowd. The image is from within the crowd. we can see that forces of law and order hacking their way towards us. We can see quite a lot of the field. We're quite low down, actually, so we could be a child or something. We could be knocked over, I don't know. But we're being positioned in the crowd, and what do we see? We see terror. The central thing is this woman's face. To me, that's quite a disturbing image. On the right-hand side, though, in a way, it's even more disturbing, and the kids really like this, because they felt quite uncomfortable in the end. On the right-hand side, we just see an eyeball. Whose eyeball? That's the interesting question. I don't know if you can see it very well from Zoom, but in the iris of this eyeball is reflected this soldier hacking. So actually, the one on the right-hand side takes the perspective of the military. This is the eye of a protester who is about to be slashed with a sword by someone on horseback. Why have they chosen that? We asked the kids. And this is a really good way of dramatizing this idea of decision. What decisions are made? What are the implications of those decisions? How do those decisions affect the experience of the reader? What if those decisions were different? And go away, kids, and make your own proposal for how we're going to do this. All right, so we did a very simple thing. It's a very simple study, this. We asked one question. And by the way, there is a version, you can read an initial article. I'm currently working on a more sophisticated one. There's an article, and also Raphaël has this, and I'll be very happy to share it with you if you're interested. This is really reflection. So it's talking about the design of the lessons and just reflecting from the perspective of the teacher. But in terms of data collection, we focused on one really simple thing, which is at the beginning and at the end, we asked the kids this question. Explain the decisions that historians must make, there's no avoiding these decisions, when they tell stories about the past. So we wanted to develop their notion of historians as decision makers, narrators as decision makers, making decisions that affect the audience's thinking. And then we just compared whether they thought there were different kinds of decisions at the beginning and at the end. Here's an example. So on the yellow text is one child's answer from the beginning of this sequence. So they, that's the historians, need to find sources from the past and different points of view from the time to try and have accurate information. They need to decide what they think and what the evidence suggests is the true story. Again, if we had time, we could discuss that, but to me, that's an epistemic framing of what the historian does. There's nothing narrative, really, about that. They talk about point of view, but not as a narrative point of view. They're talking about real points of view at the time. So if you like, the left is what we typically do in history education, develop epistemic insights. The right is a different child, actually not the same one, but this is what we wanted more of, and in some cases we got it. I'll read it for you. When writing about the past, a historian needs to decide what perspective to show it from and how much detail to add, because we can't include everyone's story. They also need to decide what is important to the story. Interestingly, very clear focus on decision-making in both cases. In the green, an awareness that there's narrative decisions. It isn't just epistemic. I haven't finished the analysis. This is classic coding, thematic analysis, and then quantitative counts. But what I found so far in the answers I've coded is an interesting shift. So here, we can see the kinds of things that the kids tended to focus on most at the beginning. Classic issues around sources. As I say, most of the time, that's what history education is about, working from the sources to the narrative. And what you can see is what happens in the majority so far of the answers at the end. Narration, 65.2% is the count for that in terms of what figures in the kids' answers. So what do I conclude from that? And then I'll stop. I think that I can't conclude very much because I'm only beginning my work on this. What we can begin to argue, though, is that if you focus on narration, kids also focus on narration and get insights they don't have if you don't focus on narration. So in other words, we've got some evidence that teaching kids about how stories are made can help them understand that, which is positive. Whether or not that makes any difference, whether or not it has any bearing on the issues I started with, the critique of populist narratives, that's a matter for further research and longitudinal study. And I have to confess, I haven't done very much at all about those other two areas, which are very important that I mentioned. But that's me done. I'll be quiet now. But my point really was to argue for this as an aim, developing narrative agency, and to share some preliminary work, theorizing what that might mean, and some even more preliminary work, sharing some outcomes of research. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. I will talk a bit in English since I did the presentation in French. Sentez-vous à l'aise aussi de poser des questions en français que je pourrais traduire. Je voulais juste souligner, I wanted to emphasize that this is recorded. So if you miss some of it, or if you want to further reflect on Arthur's point, know that it will be made available. And I kind of see who's in the room, so I could send you a link to his presentation. In a video, I could also send a PowerPoint and some PDF of the article that Arthur speak about at the end of his presentation. And I would also like to thank CRIFPE-Laval and the CELAT, the two of the research center I'm part of, for bringing Arthur in Quebec. And we're also going to go in Gatineau tomorrow for another conference organized by the Association of Canadian Studies. So that's another event. But for now, let's focus on Arthur's point. He made many around the importance of narrative in our life, in children's lives, some highly reflective theorists who have think about these issues. So I'm just wondering if any audience member has question, wants to share their reflection. I see some people in the room also have worked on these issues. So maybe we can go by either raise hand or take voice. And hope everything's worked with the technology so that we can hear you right. David, Mr. David Scott.
I think Denise was
Denis was in first. Hey, Denis. So, yeah. Denis Jeffries.
No, you can go first. You can go first because I'm a bit shy. I can try to speak in English, but sorry in advance, for my English because I don't practice quite often. And and also, Mr. Chapman, thank you very much for your presentation, for your conference. It was very, very rich. I've heard many things, but I'm not sure if I was able, because it was fast, to understand everything. But I would like just to maybe ask some question. One of the question I would say is just to be sure that, I understand very well what you said, and other question about the theory you use for the pattern of a narrative. I've been working also for years into this field of narrative, and but I come more from socio-anthropology. Then I've been using, the anthropologists for the theories of anthropologists to make my own understanding of a narrative. But I think it's always, we have always the same conception that I would say, and you tell me if it's right, that a narrative is always a construction of meaning to create meaning effects. Then you can make a construction of a narrative, to make the people cry, laugh, to go to war, to hate the Muslim, or to tell them that we belong to one nation. And the narrative of an history, the history of a country is quite often, the story that we give meaning to the kids to tell them that we belong to one nation. Then probably, like what used to say Mercier Eliade, who was a historian of religions, a narrative has always this function to create an identity. narrative is always, what the foundation of an identity and any kind of identity, even an individual identity, group identity, region identity, nation, or religion, or even a human being identity. For him, it was very important. He always said also that in a narrative, whatever narrative, there is always a big part of fiction, because the meaning, if you want to seduce somebody, the logical, rational argument is not enough, then you have to use fiction. Then in narrative, there will be always fiction, because the fiction will show something that will prepare the future. And then I always use many patterns, but the pattern of Iliad, that is about the same. That Vladimir Propov or Joseph Campbell, they use also the same pattern. For them, the pattern is always, there is always 4 elements. First, the origin of the word, the origin of something. Where do we come from? After, there is always what somebody, our ancestors of old heroes have done to put order in time and space. Like there was something first, something second, something third, and where those things happens. After, there will always a third element, say the ethics element. What should we do, to have a good life, to give the art of the gods, or things like this. And after, it's always where are we going? And that's the place where they put, the more of the fictions. And what you said about the probably, I'm not sure, but I've been reading Todorov, years ago. But for him, he was closer to what we call initiative narrative, where a hero has to escape from traps, or to resolve some problems, to go to somewhere. And this kind of things always bring hopes to the other, because if he is able to do so, then everybody is able to do so. Then this pattern that I used for the narrative, I was not sure if it's the same that you use. But just to finish, because I want to make it short, I love very much your metaphor of camera, to talk about the perspective and point of view or angle with the students. It's always a good things to do when you teach to the kids, to tell them that when you focus, you see something. But I would say, like Paul Ricard at the end, that the narrative are always in conflicts, and maybe the conflicts is the only way to go further to enrich the reality. And the measure of a narrative is another narrative, because there is no narrative over all the narrative to tell us what is the truth. Then we have no choice to say that we can just interpret a narrative in relation with another one. Sorry for my English.
But no, that was very clear, and also there's much there that I find really stimulating. So thank you very much for that contribution. I think you're right. I mean, just to pick up on the last point. So in different countries, we have slightly different approaches to historical thinking. The Canadian approach that Peter Seixas developed is very interesting to think about. Comparatively, comparing it to what happens in England, for example. And that really underlines your point that it's helpful to have more than one thing if we're going to try and think. The idea that there's one that's true and that we want to get to the final one is a utopia. I think what we need to do when we're working with children is work with many examples of things. But in England, one of the things we do that doesn't actually figure explicitly, though I'm sure Lindsay and others will correct me if I'm missing it out, it doesn't figure explicitly in the Canadian one. In England, we have this concept in curriculum and history called interpretations, plural. And the idea there is that we should make sure in history education that we draw kids' attention to the fact that there's more than one story, and that we should be comparing different stories as a way of helping them develop their thinking. So that's just a reflection and a response to your final point about plural narratives. And you know, the solution is never to find the right one, but to compare different ones. And yes, I mean, there's so many powerful theories we can draw upon. So Vladimir Prop and the Russian formalists and so on give us lots to work with. And interestingly, I mentioned the book by Stefan Levesque in my presentation. I was really heartened and inspired actually reading that to find a history educator talking about Vladimir Prop, you know, because this is where we need to go. And really, I think my big point, which may be a surprise to someone outside history, is we just haven't done enough in history education to engage with all these powerful tools that will help us think about narrative. And in a way, we're catching up. You know, the way we've modeled history education has been centrally around epistemology, around questions of sources and what you can say, rather than, it seems to me, a much more important, or at least equally important question, which is, what is this thing called narrative? How is it used? How can it be abused? How is it structured? Which is where I'm hoping to go. But yeah, I know that these are ideas that anthropologists have worked with much more than history educators. Mm. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You might go to David's comment.
David.
Is that okay? Okay, merci. Je vais poser mon question en anglais, mais je suis à Calgary maintenant. So I thank you for that presentation. I really appreciated it, and I appreciated the sort of covering the landscape of memory studies and bringing in the work of Wurst and others. And maybe I just want to pose a question that tries to make some connections to that work. So I've been very interested in this idea of, you know, sometimes it's called prior knowledge, or, you know, Wurst talks about schematic narrative templates. So how we come to the narratives through our socialization in different social cultural contexts, we get socialized into certain narratives and tropes, and that tends to frame how we engage with the narratives we come into contact with. And often when those narratives that we're encountering run counter to ones that we're not familiar with, we try to subsume them into the pre-existing narratives that we use as sort of like an orientational frame. And sometimes that's seen as quite cognitive, but I would say it's also quite ontological in the sense that it's very connected to our own identity and life experiences and notions of nationalism and what we identify with. So I guess my question is, like, have you thought about like how students' prior knowledge might be shaping how they encounter and engage with these narratives, and how we might sort of foreground that a little more clearly, I guess, and engage with those things that they're already using to make sense of these narratives as they're analyzing them? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the question.
That makes excellent sense, and it's a very, very important observation. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. So, you know, the cognitivist approach would say, and you know, we can talk about Piaget and assimilation and all of that. You know, we make sense of experience on the basis of models we already have, and I think schema theory is powerful in pointing to that. But yeah, we don't have enough research about the narrative resources that kids bring in the classroom. I think we should be researching that more, but I think also there's a pedagogic dimension to this. So we should be trying to develop schema, you know, develop kids' resources for interpreting narratives by developing reflection, you know, foregrounding how people read narratives, and also how narratives want to be read, you know, because these schema inform the writing as well as the reading. And you know, maybe what developing narrative agency, to use this phrase, would be trying to multiply kids' schema, you know, give them more knowledge resources. We need to understand what they bring to our classes, otherwise we can't teach them. We need to understand how they're reading narratives already and the role those narratives play in their lives. But we also need to be thinking about how we can give them more resources, you know, teach them different ways of reading narratives. that's really my contention. So I think you're absolutely right. You know, they will come with the schemata, sorry. That's what the research tells us. But we don't actually have, in history education, certainly in England anyway, we don't have a suitably differentiated account of what those are. In recent years in England, I don't know quite why, but E.D. Hirsch has become massively popular. Everyone's talking about schema and schemata, but only for substantive issues. You know, what is a king? That kind of thing. Concepts that describe the world. We need to differentiate that and talk about the schema and schemata, whatever that people bring, the prototypes, the templates, the notions of scripts or what an action sequence might be. Yeah, you're quite, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you said. All I want to add to it is we need to know that, and we probably want to change the schema they bring, or at least help them elaborate them and give them more so they can read the world in more ways than they could when they came to us. Because education should be about empowerment. Anyway, I don't know if that's an answer, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
We got Lindsay with a question.
Bonjour, Raphael. Thanks everyone for organizing this. Arthur, welcome to North America. Relatively close time zone for one of our first times ever. I have a couple questions that maybe are seemingly simplistic. And one of the things that I've really struggled with, and I feel like I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole, is this question about what is a narrative. Almost in a sense of, and you gave an example with the title of the graphic novel. I've been thinking about proto-narratives around monuments and other kinds of pieces, that we have so many different types of historical narratives. And the more I think about it, I think, you know, a title or a sentence can be a narrative to some degree. And so I think, and I would echo your thoughts about this. One of the issues I think we have is that we're not very aware of the different forms of narratives that students are interacting with on a regular basis as part of their lives. The second question I have, you know, in addition to the what is a narrative, would be, you know, you talked about this difference in the student pre and post examples of the Peterloo massacre narrative in itself. You talk about the difference in this, you know, a really epistemological look and more of a narrative or narrative look. But to me, when I look at those two examples, it seems like there's been a big shift in their epistemological understanding of history. The first one is to tell an accurate story, consider multiple sources, you know, to be as accurate as possible. And the after epistemology is much more constructivist, right? That they're constructing understanding, that they're telling a story, that they see this in a much different way. And so I wonder how much, you know, going back to, you know, Peter Lee, your supervisor, and some of this other work, that dealing with the epistemology of narrative, while it is a really key part of this deconstruction at the same time.
Okay, so I mean, Lindsay, great to see you as well. So Lindsay's asking me to define narrative, which it took Paul Ricoeur 3 volumes, I think, to get a good slice on that. But yeah, I mean, I think a narrative is always an attempt to do all sorts of different things. One of the things that interests me about it is when you're making decisions about a narrative, you're deciding what to foreground. You know, narrative usually is an account of some agent or other. If we wanted to simplify anthropologically, there's an agent doing something, threatened by something, reacting in some way. You've got to have change for there to be a narrative. You know, there are various things you could talk about. But yeah, one of the decisions that interests me is whose story it is. You know, narrative is always a kind of a decision about what it is that merits telling, what it is that needs to be foregrounded. So there are lots of dimensions to narrative. It's going to involve change. The classic example, I think E.M. Forster, the novelist, came up with, which is, let me see if I can get it right. Yeah, it's something like the king died, full stop, the queen died. Right? We don't have a narrative there. You've just got 2 events in sequence. But when we start to attribute some relation between the 2, and to say, you know, there's a causal relationship or an agentive relationship within there, and we have a narrative. So the example Ian Foster gives is the queen died, and then the king died of grief. You know, so now we've actually got a narrative. We don't just have 2 singular factual statements. we've got some process or some linkage between the two that we've decided to foreground. So yeah, I mean, I think defining narrative is a task that is a complex one, and I won't attempt to do now. But I mean, here are some of the dimensions. So narrative is going to involve change, but crucially for me, it involves deciding what you think is worth focusing on, what you want to give priority to. So there are kind of ontological choices to be made. In terms of your second point, I think it was an excellent one. I mean, there's a lot more going on than I've highlighted here. My coding system is extremely simple. I just decided to contrast narration versus sources, but within those categories, there are lots of subcodes. And as you say, there could well be some kind of understanding of the ontology of narrative or something here. But I would say, I mean, maybe it's splitting hairs, but there's more to it than just epistemology, I think. And knowing that a story is constructed, to me, that's something about the ontology of story as much as it's about epistemology. And how did they get there? Of course, they got there through a focus on narration, not on a focus on epistemology. So I don't know if that answers your question, but so yeah, there's much more to be done with this data than I've done. And also, I've got a question, written one as well. Yeah, so it talks about importance, doesn't it? As you say, the last line, to decide what is important in the story. That's a judgment about significance. So yeah, I would agree with you there. So I'm not sure how coherent my answer was, Lindsay, but it was a kind of answer.
Yeah. I think we might end up there as it to respect the concept of a noon lunch, but there's many food for thought in what Arthur presented, and thank you for assisting. As I remind you, this presentation is recorded. It will be available. Other documents that Arthur presented would also be available. I will send that to email. And thank you again for having assisted to Arthur. You can communicate with him. I will send you the info to continue the discussion on narrative and keep the story going. So have a good afternoon, everyone, and see you around. Thank you.
So just finally, thank you so much for being such an appreciative audience. Thank you, Raphael, for hosting me and driving me around. And thank you so much to the university for the invitation. It's a real honor to be with you.